Can you be addicted to an emotion?
Absolutely, like exercise is a great example. So of course there's a physical aspect to it, but you get addicted to that endorphin release, that feeling of release, that peacefulness.
And what about a negative emotion? Can you be addicted to like
It can become an excessive obsessive pattern. For example, what we were talking about earlier on day 1 and what you've been learning now throughout the MAT sessions, a negative association. Right? When you have a positive need associated with a negative association, and it becomes so normal that we adapt to that negative outcome that we end up seeking for. So when we want support, for example, and we keep attracting rejection, that feeling of rejection continues, and it can actually become accepted by you, because now your barometer and your threshold for what's acceptable and what's not decreases to such an extent that being rejected when you want support becomes accepted. It becomes normal, it becomes part of your lifestyle. So what can happen is, I know exactly what you're asking. It's like, so for example, the best way that I can describe that is if you're in that state of feeling rejected, right? It's within that place of powerlessness, unresourcefulness, that you find coping mechanisms. And the coping mechanisms is what creates that sense of safety or sense of comfort. Even though it's not necessarily comfortable, but it creates a familiarity. And it's normally through that negative, toxic, as we would think, crazy way to try and reestablish that sense of coping mechanisms that brings us to a place of safety. So what can happen is we can create unconsciously situations that makes you feel rejected because you know how to cope and survive within that state of mind of feeling rejected. So every time, and ultimately it loops down to, if you look into the core essence of it, is needing to feel comfort. But then finding that sense of comfort through coping mechanisms, but you can only access the coping mechanisms through the rejection. Meaning if you were rejected enough, right, if it's a repeated pattern, that repeated pattern then becomes a repeated internal pattern, which in my opinion is emotional self-destruction. Which is sad, because ultimately what we're doing is we're looking for just comfort. We're looking for something that feels familiar. Addictions can set in if you feel playful, if you feel creative, when your dad was at the age of 12 to 13 or 11, because that's when the sperm starts to form. So if he's already smoking or drinking or abusing substances at that point, it becomes encoded in the sperm reproduction. So in that case, if you ever happen to find it, I would look at what was that emotional stress at that time, what that made him reach out for the substances, because there's a very high chance that your client will have a very similar unmet need. Because the comfort that the substances or whatever the addiction is that it brings, there's going to be already a biological familiarity in the biology of that. So if the father at that age as a child felt unworthy of mom's love and felt isolated, and then started hanging out with all the wrong crowd and started smoking, and that smoking fulfilled that feeling of isolation and unworthiness, that becomes part of the sperm's foundation of development, psychosomatically and also the chemicals. Now, if you grow up and you find yourself in a similar situation where you feel unworthy and isolated, and we're looking for that coping mechanism of trying to fulfill that feeling or to suppress it, there can be an unconscious desire for either to have that tobacco, or if you start to smoke, the chances of becoming instantly addicted to it is extremely high. Much higher than someone that doesn't have a strong predisposition for smoking in the biological makeup. I'll pause.
So that's when the child is less than 12.
Yeah.
You see that.
It's around that age period. So my dad is a really good example. He told me he was smoking cigarettes and drinking from the age of 9. So when I was a teenager and I picked up a cigarette and I had a Smirnoff the first time, boom, that was it. Even the cigarettes would make me throw up in the beginning. I couldn't resist having it. It would make me feel even more anxious when I had it, and I would still have it because the desire for it was so strong. And also another cool part, just want to add to my smoking addiction, was it didn't fully shift the first time when I worked on it. And then I realized that the second round when I did it, it was because I associated my dad's presence with the smoking, because he was a chronic smoker as well. But my dad could get quite, abusive and very verbal. So it wasn't safe for me to be around my dad. But of course there was a part of me deep down that was craving my dad's love and my dad's attention. So the smoke would remind me of my dad, but in a way that made me feel safe. So when there were times when I would miss my dad or miss that masculine support, I would have a cigarette. And it would unconsciously remind me of my dad, but in a way help me to connect to him in a way that's safe. And also, if your mom abused substances while she was pregnant with you as well, drinking, smoking, even medication abuse. And also a huge one is isolation after birth. Like if you're going to be in that incubator for 2 to 3 weeks, that can be a very big onset point for a deep sense of disconnection and isolation. That's the empty, bottomless pit void that people talk about. You don't have to be in an incubator for that. It can be that you were left alone for long periods of time. Or you were between different people that you didn't recognize. But ultimately, disconnection and isolation from mom. Same. Meaning if another woman carries a child on behalf of a couple, if she abuses substances, that's a problem.
So that means the premature baby is a tendency to get addiction in the future? Because in
Yes,
a premature
they tend to have they tend to have an addictive personality.
personality.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that means whatever they touch or do can become an addiction. It doesn't have to be substances.
Mm.
That makes a lot of sense because I was premature, very premature, and mom was an alcoholic and smoking.
Yeah, you wanted to get out of that environment, yeah.
And I've struggled with addictions my whole life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. Yeah, so it's your mom's overlap of addictions that you're battling with. The problem is not, you're not the source of the problem. Yeah.
Like the cards are stacked against you. But then, so in my son, so if I think about it now, he's 18 now. I was smoking, when he was 12, and he's smoking now.
Because secondhand smoke is also addictive,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Okay, so the child, continuing her question, in the incubator, so the child will be addicted to something, is it?
But the addiction is just to fulfill that void, to fulfill that sense of needing, to have an unmet need met and its connection. So they can look for that connection through addictive behavior. It's a distraction. It's a distraction from how they emotionally feel, which is disconnected. So, and also physical abuse and sexual abuse are huge culprits. Huge, huge, huge culprits. Because of the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder, everything that comes as a psychological or physical ripple effect of that. And sometimes, especially if you don't remember being sexually abused, but you can feel the underlying physical and psychological consequences of that. And needing to silence a voice that you don't understand. Right? Needing a relief from that, needing an escape from that. So it's not that the substance necessarily becomes addictive, it's the action that you take in order to escape what you feel.